Hello and welcome to Freed Indeed Live. I am your host, Kevin J.N. Hughes, and I am here today to discuss the freedom of the will and why the issue of free will is important and why I feel like in Western debates about free will, there's something missing in the debate. So, I want to fill in a little bit of that gap and hopefully clarify why I've come to reject Western theories about free will and embrace Holy Orthodoxy instead. Now, before I get into that, I want to remind you guys that if you want to support the show, you can do so with the links in the description below. Also, I want to remind you guys to support our sponsors. For example, God the Father Apparel. God the Father Apparel is an excellent clothing line. They have really neat stuff, and right now they have some vintage style stuff and just really cool products. So go to their website, godthefatherapparel.com, and at checkout, use promo code FREED. That's promo code FREED, FREED, and you'll be supporting Freed Indeed Ministries. You'll be supporting this show, but you'll also be supporting everything else we do here at Freed Indeed. So without further ado, let's get into free will. So there's a really awesome book, or a really good book, very well written book, called What About Free Will? Which is a book by a Reformed Protestant who basically examines the kind of standard Reformed teaching of compatibilism along with the sort of more extreme teaching of hard determinism that is taught by hyper Calvinists, and many Reformed Baptists teach it. Many sort of mainstream Calvinists do teach this very hard determinism in which God exhaustively decrees everything that comes to pass, and human beings have no freedom of will whatsoever. We are simply carrying out the decree that God has made from the beginning. Versus compatibilism, which says that God has exhaustively decreed everything, but that we are also freely choosing whatever it is we're choosing, and so both and is compatibilism. And then he also examines the idea of what's called libertarian free will, where human beings have, it's kind of the opposite end of the extreme, you might say, when it comes to, so if you have hard determinism as one extreme, then compatibilism kind of tries to straddle the middle, and then libertarian free will is the idea that the human will is not constrained in any way, that any given person could make any given choice, and there's absolutely nothing compelling the human will. This is why the philosopher John Locke, in his argument for libertarian free will, describes the human being as what's called a tabula rasa, meaning that the human being is could be anything. It's entirely up to our choice. This is the philosophy behind statements like "we make our own destiny." When someone says that they make their own destiny, they're talking about libertarian free will. That everything I do is entirely my own decision, and that there's nothing compelling or constraining that decision. Now, I think that all of these approaches have advantages, have flaws, but something gets lost in this discussion, and that's what I want to talk about today, because even in the book What About Free Will, despite the fact that he attempts to be very exhaustive, and I think he is very thorough in that book, so that you guys can. Since I keep talking about that book, I want to. What about free will? I don't think I have a way to do screen share yet on this program that I'm using, but here it is. Scott Christensen is the author of that book. It has a foreword by D.A. Carson. The book is called What About Free Will? Reconciling Our Choices with God's Sovereignty. And I'm trying to find. I think it's available on Amazon. It's available on, looks like Goodreads. And Scott Christensen is the author. Oh, the book is from 2016. Anyway, yeah, so it's not a very long book, just 304 pages, pretty decent. I would recommend that book if this is something that you want to learn more about. I would definitely recommend reading that. I don't think it's complete though, and I'll say why. The reason why I don't think that book is perfect is because it does not cover the Orthodox perspective. It only compares Western theories of free will. And in the book Christ the Eternal Tao, which is, frankly, this book is just blowing my mind. And as I was reading it this morning, I came upon this section, and this book has just been so wonderful and so powerful. And this section perfectly explains what I think is missing in the debate about free will as it rages in the West. So I'm going to read a section of this book and then we'll talk about it. This is from page 219 of Christ the Eternal Tao. It says, when man, in wrongly using his free will, departed from the way, the Tao, he corrupted his primal simplicity and became fragmented. Divested of the primal glory of the garment of the uncreated light that had enveloped him, he now found himself naked. Genesis 3:7. His spiritual corruption and death made him subject to physical corruption and death. After his transgression, writes St. Macarius of Egypt from AD 390, man's thoughts became based and material, base, not based, became base and material, and the simplicity and goodness of his mind were intertwined with evil and worldly concerns. And then Hieromonk Damascene continues, he says, his will became divided. Now his natural will, which remained inclined to follow the way in all things, was set against his free will, which had now taken on itself the inclination to depart from the way. So, what that means is that as Orthodox Christians, when we talk about free will, we're actually talking about two different things, and this is why the Blessed Augustine talks about free will as being sort of like there's two wills within me as a person. So the Blessed Augustine describes it that way, that it's almost as if there's two wills in me. There's one will that desires to follow God and strive after the kingdom and live in righteousness. But there's another aspect of me, another will, we might say, that's at war within me, that desires the things of the flesh and desires to pursue worldly avenues and desires sinful things. So because there's this sort of war happening within me, I have to choose consciously to follow the way, to follow Christ and to live in Him. Whereas, like Adam, before Adam sinned, there was no war going on within him. There was only the desire to follow God. I would say that his will was truly free. because it was free from sin. And that's the kind of freedom that we'll have in glory as well. We will no longer have a divided will, but we will instead have a truly free will because we will be free from the bondage of sin. There'll be no more compulsion towards sinful things for us. There will only be the sweet freedom of that simplicity that Adam had. And this is what we pray for, and this is why our lives need to be lives of such prayer, because that's what we're trying to cultivate within ourselves. And that's what I'm getting at when I say that there's something missing in this debate in the West. Because the debate in the West takes the form of asking what I feel is the wrong question. So, the question that is asked in the West is, to what extent do I, from the moment of my birth, have the ability to choose right and wrong? And of course, the answer is the answer is that we have the ability to choose between right and wrong, but and not everybody thinks that. You know, the hard determinists believe that we really don't have the ability to choose the right unless God makes us choose the right. And compatibilists believe that we don't really have the ability to choose the right unless and until God changes our hearts, and then when He changes our hearts, we freely choose the right because it's now what we desire. Um, and then libertarian free will people simply believe that, you know, sort of that tabula rasa thing of John Locke, that we have 100% free ability, unconstrained, to choose either good or evil. But I think that that whole debate is asking the wrong question, because it's simply asking the question of whether or not I have the ability to choose good or evil today, whether or not, and kind of obviously, I think we would all say that we need, or at least even people who believe in libertarian free will, I think would say that we want God to help us to make the right decisions and influence us to make the right decisions. But I think that where this issue in the West is wrong, is asking the wrong question perhaps, is that in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, we ask a little bit of a different question, and I think that this question is more practical for the spiritual life. That question is, how can I conform my will to God? In other words, we aren't so interested in debating whether or not I have the ability to choose the right. We're more interested in asking the question of how I can make myself the kind of person who will choose the right. And maybe that doesn't happen all at once, right? Like, most of us experience this as a lifetime of hard work, but that in that hard work, in that discipline, in that diligence, what I'm trying to do is change myself to become a person who chooses the right. Maybe not every time, but at least more often than I did yesterday. I want to choose the right path more often tomorrow than I did yesterday. I want to choose righteousness over sin more readily than I did yesterday today. Um so that's the goal. And hopefully by the as we do this, we do grow and we do get to a point where we're free from sin, so that we have cultivated that, and we have become the person who chooses the right. I just saw something today, and I want to see if I can find it again to share with you guys, because it just occurred to me that this really excellently explains exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about how we're trying to cultivate in ourselves the true freedom of following God. So, okay, it wasn't posted by the page that I thought it was posted by. So what it was saying was basically that it had a quote from a saint where he was saying that the goal of, I'm trying to remember how exactly he worded it, but it was basically saying that very often, again, he's saying we ask the wrong question, because very often in the West or in modern Christianity, we talk about what happens to a person after they die. My next book club, after I finish the whole Council of God book club, the next book club after that is actually going to be Father Seraphim Rose, The Soul After Death. So this is an important question. But this is the question that tends to fascinate and captivate us the most, is this question of what happens after we die. The fathers asked a different question. Their question was not so much what's going to happen to me after I die as what can I become while I am alive? How holy can I be while I'm alive? How much can I pursue God while I'm alive? And I think that should be the question that we ask. I also think that in addition to that being the question that we should ask, I think that when it comes to free will, that should be the sort of framework that we're coming from as we think about free will as well. We shouldn't be thinking about free will as a question of how free is my will. We should be coming at free will from the question of how can I make my will more free to follow Christ? How can I break my will of its bondage to sin? So I think that the hard determinists and compatibilists have a good point in that the human will, by its nature, tends to be very inclined towards things that are not good for it. We are inclined towards sinful thoughts and sinful desires, and we need to put those inclinations to death. However, I think that the libertarian free will people have a good point that this is something that must be worked through with God. This is something that God is not just going to zap you and make you all of a sudden have the correct view and make you all of a sudden do the right thing. He's going to cause you need to work with him in that process. So, with all that said, though, I again just want to reiterate that we need to make sure that we're asking the right question. We need to make sure that instead of choosing one of those ideas and fighting for it, instead we need to ask ourselves, how can I today be laboring with God for if in this particular video, maybe you're a reformed person and you believe, in justification by faith alone, and all this. But usually even reformed people believe that we participate in our sanctification. So put this in that category if you need to. Obviously, I would rather everybody just convert to Orthodoxy, but that you're having a conversation with God. Your conversation with God may be in a different place than mine, but at least put this into your framework that today, instead of arguing with somebody online about whether or not they have free will, today ask yourself, what can I do to conform my will more to Christ, to set my will more free from the things of sin so that I can be a better servant of God. So thank you very much for watching. That's all I have for you today. God bless, and please do share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed.